Välkommen allesammans! Today I'm speaking about Odin, going in a little bit deeper. So, Odin, in our myths, he is the most mentioned god, and he's also by far the most complex god in regards to, what he really represents. So the general idea is that Odin represents a part of our own soul. His name derives from the word Oder, and it's also what he is referred to as in the myths many, many times. And that's also one of the 8 parts of our soul, one of the rings of Draupnir. Directly translated, Oder means spirit, frenzy, ecstasy, that deepest part of our brain. We call it the reptilian brain, call it the fight or flight response, whatever you want. There's just no good English word for it, really. But yeah, Odin, in one way, represents the deepest level of our soul that's with us in life, death, dreams, wherever. Some of the myths, it's pretty clear that Odin represents journeys that us and our own souls can go on. But it's more than just that. In other myths, Odin represents some sort of universal consciousness. It's not just your soul, but the kind of the collective soul of all living things. And it absolutely seems like Odin is some sort of spiritual entity that can be called upon to help us in certain situations. Don't get me started on that. That's a long subject for another video, and I'm not going to be speaking about that right now. In this video, I'm just speaking about Odin as a real human being that lived and what the sources say about that. Or if he was multiple human beings that lived. Because some of the myths really do seem like this was the case, and I'm going to speak about 2 very clear ones right here. One myth that you're probably all familiar with is Odin in Mimir's Well, where Odin goes down underground beneath the roots of Yggdrasil and comes across a giant talking head named Mimir. And then Odin cuts out his eye in exchange for a drink from the Well of Wisdom. And that's the well that this severed head, this giant head Mimir drinks from every day. Okay, so it sounds like a bunch of crap to any person with half a brain, but any person wouldn't really believe that happened. However, when we look at another account of this story that comes in Ynglinga Saga, it doesn't sound quite so crazy. So it tells in one of the first few chapters there how the Aesir and the Vanir weren't gods, but they were 2 actual very real tribes, and they exchanged hostages because they were warring, and then Mimir was one of these hostages. And long story short, Mimir gets beheaded, and Odin, or somebody referred to as Odin, ends up preserving the head with herbs and a smear on it so it wouldn't decompose. So Odin could keep this head and communicate it with the dead Mimir. Now, hold on a minute. That story is actually not that hard to believe at all. We have primitive cultures from all over the world that did this aspect of preserving a head in order to achieve some sort of connection from the soul of that person. It was called head hunting. In Europe, it was called shrunken heads. In South America, they were all done for different purposes, but it was always done for some sort of connection with the soul, keeping that soul alive of that person. Now, that doesn't sound so hard to believe, does it? The myth that we read about Odin cutting his own eye and a giant talking head and a well in the underworld, yeah, that sounds ridiculous because it's, over-exaggerated and filled with metaphors and symbolism to make it easier to remember over 1,000 years. But yes, it absolutely could be based on a real event that happened. I'm not saying it did, but, it's one possibility. Another myth comes in Grimnismal, one of the most famous poems that we have. It's about when Odin is disguised as Grimnir and he gets captured and tortured by the giant king Geirröd. And then Geirröd's son Agnar comes to try and help out Odin. And in exchange, Odin has some visions of Valhalla and tells Agnar all about it. And then Odin basically curses the king and he ends up falling on his sword and he becomes friends with Agnar pretty much. It sounds crazy, with giants and magic and, different realms and stuff like that, but we hear an almost identical story and a very real, reliable saga, and that's Halfdan the Black's saga. Halfdan the Black was a Norse king he captured and tortured a wizard, and it was his son, Harald Fairhair, who actually freed him. You all know Harald Fairhair, and it's literally almost an identical story with a few differences in the details that I will go into later on. Also, the fact that the very first mentions of Valhalla in the poetry come in the 900s, early 900s, late 800s, and that is exactly when King Harald Fairhair lived. So it's very possible that this happened, and these are just some things that line up, and there are quite a few more myths like this that actually line up well with real historical events that we believe to have happened. So of course I don't think Odin is a real human being walking among us, or a god walking among us, an immortal god that just is watching over us all the time and walking the world when he feels like it. No, these two stories take place almost 800 years apart. And why would we hear about Odin living that far apart from each other if he wasn't some kind of immortal god? Well, you can't forget that the Norse believed in reincarnation. They had rituals, they had traditions. Not only did they believe in reincarnation, but they had these rituals and things in order to help them figure out exactly who they were in past lives. We have quite a few records of this that prove that the Norse had ways of finding out exactly this, who they were in past lives. Today, we've lost these rituals, but back then they could discover actually who they were in past lives. So these examples that we see of Odin being a real human being at different time periods according to different sources, I'm listing them right here, it doesn't sound that crazy. In my opinion, all these different sources that place Odin living at different times, it's not that they viewed him as some kind of immortal god walking the earth, watching everything we do and coming into our lives from time to time, but it was actually Odin was a real human being that was originally just a normal human. Maybe he was, proficient in magic or had some advanced science or whatever, so that he really made a name for himself, and maybe he was originally named Odin or someone that they believed was Odin. And the reason he pops up at these different times in history is because he was able to figure out, the newly born Odin was able to figure out that he actually was Odin in this past life, and he actually could pass these life events on. I think, in my opinion, Odin is probably even walking among us today. It could be me, it could be you, but like I said, these rituals and knowledge have been lost. We don't have a way of figuring out who we were in past lives anymore, but there are some great people trying to bring this knowledge back and doing some experiments on this. And there's some really great books by a scientist by the name of Ian Stevenson. He's probably the one who has done the most research, legitimate research into reincarnation. So I'll put links to some of his books in the description below. They're my top 5. It's my number 1 favorite scientific book, but top 5 favorite books of all time. So yeah, that's about it for this video. Hope that just, sheds a little bit of light on things, because we're going to be speaking about Odin a whole lot more, and, exactly what this deity could mean and all the different possibilities there. So that's it for today. Vi ses nästa gång.